Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here this afternoon to talk about and discuss user-centered evaluation. Due to technical programs, I don't have my notes in here, so bear with me if I don't remember or stumble on some words. A short presentation of myself. I work here in Norrköping, together with parts of the organizing committee, like Kostya and Andreas. I'm part of Andreas' unit, Information Visualization. I see more colleagues here as well. Glad to see you here. I have a background in cognitive science, human-computer interaction, and visualization. I do not work with graph drawing or network visualization, etc., but I know a thing or two about evaluations, so that's why I'm here. I'm an associate professor and docent in evaluation methodology for visualization. I think we should start with this image. What do you think about that one? Be open.
Before ruining the flow, would you perhaps try to click on that little blue button? I imagine that's one more annoying Zoom window that has popped up recently.
Okay, let's see if I have a mouse here. There.
Up later.
Thank you. So let's see what you say.
Almost identical like almost. And also the angles, kind of, but not perfectly.
Thank you. Someone else? What about the contrast? Black on white and the other colors. I actually think we should have started with that one. What about contrast now?
Is the labels also part of that?
Yeah. The text. I'm thinking about the text. If I do like this, there's a better contrast, right?
Yeah, but it's still.
There's still issues with it, right? Yeah. And what if I do like this? If I move the text a bit to make it centered here and not interfering with that big one there?
It's better because the big one attracts more attention. So when you see them, you could have it.
Yes, good. But what about if we change the layout entirely? Is this better? Why is it better?
More readable.
More readable. Great. And like that? A bigger heading. That is how we usually do it, right?
If it's important.
If it's important, super good. Very, very good. Thank you for that. So, what is the point here? We need to make sure we need to make some sort of evaluation, right? We need to test. And we need to think about why should we test it? What is the aim with this image? Did it do what it was supposed to do? It gave some sort of sense of what the conference is about, right? My name and my affiliation. So that worked, but then there's so many things that can be sort of anyway. So that is sort of the overall objective and aim with this workshop. I want to introduce the topic of evaluation and try to provide some general knowledge about it. There's different phases of an evaluation study. We will look briefly into each one of them. And also there are things that are important to consider, both at the planning stage, when you actually conduct the evaluation, and afterwards when you sort of analyze and deal with the data and write your conclusions. I also hope I have inserted a number of references that I hope can guide you in future studies in this area. And if you are interested, I encourage you to look into these papers because they in turn have a lot of good citations that will guide you further. And also, if you want to learn more, I of course have to advertise. Is anyone going to the VIS conference later this fall? Yeah. I will, together with a colleague, give around 4-hour tutorial in the subject. We have given that at the VIS conference a couple of times before. Then we can go into more detail into each subject. And also Niklas focuses quite a lot on quantitative research and the analysis of that data. So let's see. You will also, in the end of the afternoon, actually conduct an evaluation. We're going to do an exercise. There will be several alternatives. but I hope that you will take the chance to actually try it out. And it will be, as I said, several options, but all of you will discuss and reflect both on the actual methodology, what could have, what went well, what could have been changed, and why, so to speak. Are you up for some creative action later on? Great. So, but I will start here. When we talk about what we should study, it's often common that we talk about usability, right? Are you familiar with the ISO definition of usability? Yeah, it says, to the extent which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals with effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction, and also in a specified context of use, which is very, very important, right? And here is an explanation of what this actually means. Effectiveness is about accuracy and whether you can do things or not, if you can reach your goals. If you can, what does it take? Here we often measure how much time we spent on task completion, or we can measure cognitive load, for example. And then we have the subjective dimension here. What do users actually think? What do they experience? What are their attitudes, etc., towards the thing that we are looking into? And most important, usability is never just based on these three dimensions. It always depends on the users, their goals, and also the usage situation. Do you think in these terms when you talk about perhaps effectiveness, efficiency, subjective satisfaction, etc.? No? How many of you have done an evaluation before? A few of you. Have you considered these factors? Yes, great. I have a really, really simple example here. This is an Excel graph. What do you think about this? No, we shouldn't go there. But can you tell me that this illustrates temperature data for two locations in Sweden, Kiruna and Stockholm, 3 years, 22, 23, 24. If I ask you what are the temperatures for the respective location in 2023, can you tell? No. Anyone? No. The other years then?
23 easier.
Sorry?
23 easier.
Easier, yeah. But can you be confident in any of the?
No.
Any of them? No.
Easier.
Yeah. And if I show you this one, in an instant you can read what it says, right? But does this mean that this one is totally useless? It depends. Super. It depends on why are we using it and in what context, right? This is another example. Are you familiar with Gapminder? It's both a foundation and a software. It shows global data concerning economy, environment, global health, etc. And they use, sometimes they use animated bubble charts. And it's not easy to track these bubble charts and follow what actually happens on the screen, right? If I would ask you to use this software and do tasks, it would be a long sort of learning threshold, and you would most certainly not be able to make decisions in a correct manner, even without, at least not without extensive training. But in this context, where Hans Rosling, the founder, he's now deceased, unfortunately, but when he was standing in front of this type of visualization, he was a very, very engaging presenter. When he did that, you didn't have to read the data, right? You just had to follow what he said. And then this one is a perfect illustration of data, right? It's a lot more fun to look at that visualization than this type. On the other hand, if you would read a paper, trying to find something out or get something sent in an email, you would prefer this one, right? So the point is here, you always need to think about this. Who's the user? What are they supposed to do? What do they need to do? And where? And then take it from there. So, but first I would like to know, before we continue, I would like to know a bit more about you. This is from the web page. And it says that there are application areas in data science, social sciences, web computing, information systems, biology, etc. Would you like to share what you work with? And you can also think, are you more towards this side, or are you perhaps more on design, user experience, graphical design?
I'm working with urban data.
Yeah.
Trying to visualize 3D of the city.
Okay.
And the buildings. I work with urban data and calculate the city fairness.
So what are your potential users when you develop?
City planners.
City planners, okay. Nice. Anyone else? It's just nice to know what you're doing. You don't have to if you don't want to. Okay. So I also had this slide just to present the outline. We have 3 hours in total with breaks, and the lecture was given 90 minutes. We will have a short break here. I think 90 minutes, it's quite a long time to sit and just listen. And when we teach, we always take a break somewhere in the middle, so we will do that as well. I will also introduce the exercise before the coffee break. And then when you come back, you are ready to start working with that one. So that is the plan. And this is what it looks like. We are going to talk about how to plan, how to design, how to actually conduct, things to consider when you analyze, and then also when you report. But it will be in some of these phases, just a little bit of information. And then I hope, if you're interested, that you will continue to study that. So again, when we talk about evaluation, what comes in mind when you hear that word? A few of you have already done it, but the rest of you, what do you think of when we talk about evaluation?
How good our method is.
How good it is, yeah.
How usable is it?
How usable is it? Yeah. Something else? There's a number of definitions, but I just wrote this down. We'll talk about an assessment of a visualization, and I write visualization here. We can talk about the visual representation, or we can talk about a visualization technique, but you understand what I mean by this. To get useful feedback, determine merit, worth, or value. We collect data on user experience, tasks, performance, etc. We want to identify strengths and weaknesses, what is good, what is bad, etc. And this is very important, right? How it supports the user's goals and needs. No one said a specific name, but I have this illustration. Many words. And depending on in what stage of the development process you do it, who is doing it? Are you evaluating with users, or are you an expert that's doing the evaluation yourself? Is it a qualitative or a quantitative study, etc., etc.? That decides the actual word, whether you control your study or not. We will look a bit more into this. But there's so many names. And I have just done a simple sort of division into types of methods, and then also a number of examples of methods, and we will look into these ones, and you will work with some of them during the exercise. Do you know the difference between explorative, formative, summative, and longitudinal? No? You, maybe? Do you want to share?
Sure, I guess explorative would be you're prototyping something, you want to get early feedback. That sounds maybe not structured.
Yeah, thank you. How I have defined it here is that explorative is that you just investigate and look into things. You don't have really a plan. It's early stages in the development process. You just want to learn as much as possible, right? When you have come a bit, you do a formative evaluation, and that means that you gather feedback, and the aim is to get as much feedback as possible to sort of improve your visualization. And then when you think that you are finished, so to speak, then you do a summative evaluation. And then you can also do what is called a longitudinal, and that is a duration of weeks, months, even years, sometimes decades. So that is not very often that we actually do that, but there are examples. And then we differ between empirical and inspection method. And empirical is basically that you actually test with actual users, whereas inspection methods in its original form is performed by experts in something, perhaps usability experts, or you can be visualization experts, right? And then qualitative non-numerical data, and then numerical data. We also talk about whether we control or not, and that is regarding if we limit our study in one way or the other. Let's say an observation up there, purely qualitative, you observe what people do. Verbal behavior, non-verbal behavior. You don't control anything, right? You're just there. Whereas if you want to make a measurement method, then you want to control as many things as possible to be able to establish cause and effect, right? And then we have interviews, talk, think aloud, heuristic evaluation, and questionnaire. So we will cover a bit on each one of these ones. But it can be good to know about these different types when you also look into the names and what you will name your evaluation later on. And the first thing you do is to actually decide, why am I going to do this evaluation, right? What is my or our aim? And this is a paper that I found helpful when I started as a PhD in 2003. It's old, but to be honest, there's not many publications of this type out there. So this is still valid, of course. Now, I mean, 22 years has passed, right? So they don't really cite recent publications, but the general ideas are still helpful. So I recommend that you look into that one. Different aims here. I don't need to read them all, but we have already touched upon some of them, right? And now I have underlined some of the words. And why do you think that I have done that?
They're more important.
No, that's not why. They are important, yeah. But the question is, in what sense? Someone said useful. Was it you that mentioned the word useful before, right? Yeah. If you say you want to investigate that your new technique is useful in the practical sense, according to some objective criteria. What do you mean by useful?
For example, we had a study about the type 1 diabetes data set that the doctors can see the visualization related to around 3 months history of the patients and their glucose level in their blood for 3 months. So visualization is the doctor goes fast and can decide that in a very short moment, and the doctor is not confused with the results. It's useful.
Yeah, good. If I want to establish that the new technique is better than the other one, what do I mean by the word better? What can I mean by the word better?
Faster.
Faster.
More accurate. So I think the word that you want to say to us is that whenever we use such a word, we have to define what we actually mean by useful or better or whatever.
Super. Thanks. Yeah. What do you mean by all these words, right? It's not uncommon that you read paper as a reviewer or as a colleague, or read your own paper and realize that you haven't really defined this enough, at least. So we talk about to define and operationalize, translate sometimes quite abstract concepts to something that is observable, testable, and measurable. And as it says here, establish a clear link between theory or previous results of your own and the empirical data that you aim to collect, right? So you need to be crystal clear about what you are measuring and how you're actually going to do it. And then this is also important. So let's say that something is faster, but is that good? What you compare with can be totally useless, right? So there we also need to think carefully about what does these measures that we collect actually mean. Absolute values or compare with something. And you should always think about to establish some sort of goal. You can do it from theory. You can do it from previous studies of your own or other authors, or you can also conduct pilot studies. Try to find thresholds, what rating would be acceptable for a good visualization, what rating is acceptable for an excellent visualization, or one that actually needs to be redesigned in some way. So don't forget that. And it can be very difficult to actually make these decisions. I mean, what specific questions are we going to investigate? What methods should we choose? What task, if any, should participants do? How should we present this? How should we analyze the results, etc.? And there is a literature out there, and I recommend this paper. Lam with colleagues published this in 2012. It's still highly relevant. They present 7 different scenarios. And in these ones, they talk about what kind of goals that you can have, what kind of questions that you can ask, what kind of data you can expect, should aim for. And also they suggest different methods, and they also present example studies and discuss also why should we do evaluation? What is the worth of the actual process? So this one I really recommend. This is another one published in 2013, and at that time they had looked at all evaluation papers published at the WIS conference during a time period of 10 years and do a similar analysis of the at the time state of the art, and also gave guidance on how to conduct evaluations and what could be relevant to look into in the future. So I guess I will share my slides somewhere later so you can get these references. And then I actually Googled, of course. Now you are the right audience here, so maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. But this paper was published in 2021. And Helen here is one of the authors, and I guess she's one of the big authorities in the field. So this should be a great publication for you to look into. They classified studies into 3 different categories here. So I just skimmed through it, but I realized that this is a highly relevant paper for you. So have a look at that one. I think that will assist you in a good way in future studies. So let's go back here. When we talk about choosing a method and then also a study design, and with design, I mean, you decide that you are going to perhaps conduct an interview, but how are you going to design that one? Who is going to participate? What kind of questions should we ask? Should we ask the same questions in the same order? Should they just answer these questions? Should we allocate time for free discussions, etc.? There's a lot of decisions to be made. Who is going to be the moderator of the study? Should we be 1 or 2 persons? There's endless things to decide, and that is what I mean by study design. So, of course, the aim of the study, why are you really doing this? And this, I have borrowed this slide from Niklas. It's part of our other tutorial. It might be the case that we want to look into whether text labels work in a specific visualization or not, right? And then also you need to come up with specific research questions that you think will give you good and useful result, and that you will be able to answer your aim and your research questions with, right? Are they beneficial for interpretation of this type of visualization technique? And then we also need to think about what could possibly sort of contaminate our results. I talked about confounding factors, right? So if we're going to look into how text labels are perceived and read, there's a number of things that we need to consider, right? That we need to control to be able to establish the results only to the different text labels and not to any other confounding factors, right? Font type, the color, people's actually language skills. Do they all have the same ability to read? Are somebody visually impaired and forgot their glasses, etc., etc.? Also, your resources and availability. How easy is it to recruit participants to an evaluation study? What do you think? They don't line up outside your office, right? And especially not if you need participants with specific characteristics. Students, I mean, we're at the campus, we can recruit a lot of students. But are they sort of the right sample for a study? Perhaps not. How many of you work with domain experts? I know that you do in the SciVis group. There's a researcher there that developed things that is used only by a very few number of people, right? So it can be very difficult. What kind of test facilities do you have? This can limit what you can actually do. And also your own experience and knowledge. So my advice is also that if you have the opportunity, team up with someone that is more knowledgeable in you, and then you can together work with a study that is perhaps more detailed, more quantitative, needs more analysis of data than you currently sort of can master yourself. So that is one advice. And when we talk about these confounding factors, we talk about level of constraints. So it's actually to the degree you try to limit or control your study in some way. And here it varies a lot. Some studies we don't control at all, or we just apply a bit of control. Whereas in quantitative experimental research, there is a high degree. And yeah, some approaches actually place fewer demands and others more. But I would say that all of them are scientifically valid if you apply them correctly, and also define and motivate why you make specific choices, and also what kind of claims you do when it comes to your results and conclusions. If you have interviewed 4 persons, you can't really say that what my findings can be generalized to hold for all people in this sort of population, right? But if you have performed a quantitative study with 50 persons, done your statistical analysis and found significant results, then you are allowed to generalize these results to hold for more people than the ones that were actually part of your study. But that also, again, depends on what is your actual aim. And why we apply all these control procedures is that we sort of always aim for as much reliability and validity in our studies as possible. And these two are very important concepts. And briefly, validity refers to how well we actually study, measure, investigate what we aim to measure and investigate. About soundness and quality. And examples here is that we can go back to the example. If we are supposed to evaluate a visualization technique that are supposed to be used in like the area that you mentioned, for example, and instead we recruit students that doesn't really have an experience here, the results aren't really valid, right? They are not representative. The same goes if we choose the wrong tasks. We claim to investigate something, but in the end we realize that they haven't really investigated an answer to this, right? And here you can have a look at this after, but we differ between construct, internal, external, and statistical. External is about whether we can generalize or transfer our results to other people's situations, etc. Statistical is important. I have a slide about that later. But when we collect quantitative data, we need to look into the nature of data. Is data normally distributed or not? Is it parametric data? That decides what kind of test that you can actually do on the data. And if you choose the wrong test, then you have compromised the statistical validity, for example. And reliability then refers to how reliable and trustworthy the data is. How have you measured it? Did you encounter any errors? Is the results, if you do repeated measures over time, are the data sort of reliable over time? Does it show basically the same result or not? And also between people. Let's say that you conduct an interview and you are 4 researchers in your research group, and you divide the participants between you. Can you be sure that you ask the same questions, that you give basically the same answers if they have questions? You can try to control this by creating an interview guide, for example, and discuss these things beforehand. But if you don't do that, then you can compromise the inter-rater reliability, for example. And if we look here into the name variable in qualitative research, we don't really talk about variables. We talk about concepts, constructs, etc. But in quantitative research, we talk about variables. And what we do is that we manipulate one or more, sometimes many, independent variables. And then we measure the effect on one or more dependent variables, right? So what could be an independent variable? Do you have any suggestions? Back in the day, I did research on 2D versus 3D visualization. So then you had representations of data, the same data, but represented in 2D or 3D. That is then an independent variable, right? With 2 levels here. And then we measured accuracy and response time, task time. And that would then be the dependent variables. That is the actual data that is produced. And the thing is here, we can give an example again. We have text labels, which is an independent variable. The actual font type is the variable. And then reading speed, memory performance, user experience are measures that we collect, and they are then the dependent variables, right? So it can look like this. You have A versus B in 2 different fonts, and that is what should vary, right? And what happens if we accidentally present B in a different color with a background or a frame? Then we haven't controlled things, right? So if there's a difference between these two, we don't know if we can attribute that difference to the actual font type or other things around. And what are these other things around them? They are the confounding factors, right? And in many studies, we aim to control this one so that we can establish that our results are reliable and they are valid and can only be attributed to the independent variable. Does this make sense? Good.
When you say user experience, what do you mean exactly?
This can be subjective measures. You can actually ask which one do you like more and why, whereas these ones are objective. It doesn't matter what one really thinks here. It's good that you ask that. Do you think that there's always a correlation between objective measures and subjective opinions? No. When I teach undergraduate students, I usually give the example that how many of you play computer games? Anyone here? Yeah. How many of you aim for having an enjoyable experience? Yeah. Stupid question, right? But how many of you also aim at always reach a higher score, a better performance? What is the main objective for you? Some of you don't really think about this, but some of you don't really care if the game is really, really difficult to learn and master, and that if there's a lot of updates, so you constantly need to learn more. You really, really want to play this and get as good as possible, whereas others mainly just want to spend time and have a good time, right? So that is a good illustration on how objective and subjective measures doesn't always correlate, and that is also something that you need to bear in mind. If you are developing something that is used in a very critical environment to take this right, but you don't really care about their user experience, right? Perhaps they work in shifts of 2 hours and they just need to work. Whereas in other environments, you perhaps focus more on that people are having a good work environment and don't really look into their performance. Of course, you want them to work well, but you understand what I mean. So thanks for asking. Okay, so then also we need to think about who are we going to engage in our study. And as I already said, it's often quite difficult to recruit people. We say that we want to have a representative sample, and that means that we need to know the users. Otherwise, we will not have a good validity in our studies, right? And if we think about a group, that is then the population, but then you need to select a smaller group that you can actually take to your lab, and that will be the sample then. So these are terms that are used in at least experimental research, perhaps not common in all evaluation papers. So you need to estimate how many people you need, and that depends on whether you are going to test one group or more. Why do you think we need 2 groups sometimes?
Compare the results.
Yes. It can be that we want to make comparisons, and for one reason or the other, do not want to or can't have just one group because they are different. They are supposed to be different. Sometimes it's also the case that the study can be long. People can get tired and you don't want them to experience fatigue because that is also another confounding factor. So then you also need 2 groups. And then also, if you do quantitative studies, you can say that the more test subjects, the better. That gives you more statistical power, which in turn means that you will have a test that is sensitive enough to sort of detect a difference and effect if it's there. We also aim to generalize from the sample to the entire population. And then you need to have many people and do statistical analysis, right? In qualitative research, we, if I generalize, often aim for a smaller sample for various reasons. It is enough. And we don't really aim there to say that the results from this interview study will hold for everyone working in this domain. We might want to try to transfer the results and discuss around it, but it is enough with a fewer number in this sample group. And then there's a question, is there then a golden number? I would say no. There is a problem with a low number of participants if they differ a lot. Let's say that you do an interview and all 4 participants that you have asked say totally different things, then you need to increase the number of participants, right? If you experience what we can call saturation, they basically have the same ideas, the same complaints, the same suggestions, then it will be enough, right? The problem with a high number is that it's difficult to recruit, and it's also very, very time consuming to actually perform, let's say, quantitative user tests. So you need to make a informed decision here. And you need to explain why you settle with or you decide on the number that you actually do. And you can find, if you read these papers, for example, that I gave you examples of, they also discuss this. So there you can also get recommendations. And if you read evaluation studies from trustworthy authors in your field that you know are doing solid work, then it feels safe to use the same number of participants as they did, right? But you always need to be aware of that reviewers might ask about this. So state that in your paper before you submit it. And then we also need to think about if we have 1 or 2 groups, how are we going to sort of allocate them to the things that they are actually going to do? We talk about within subjects design, and that means that all participants are examining the same things. They are looking into the dependent variable, and we sort of collect responses for all of them. But then we can also have between subjects design, which means that we have between subject variables. So all of the participants will look at the fonts that we present to them, but we might vary the order. And why would we vary the order of presentation of, for example, 2 different font types? It can be to balance out things like fatigue, which we should try to avoid, but there can be some sort of learning effect or similar, right? So it's often common that we try to balance these things. And then we can have different type of user groups. They will also be between group variables. And in this type of study, this is example for things that might be a reason to why you divide your participants into different groups. Sometimes age and gender is a factor. If it's not, you should avoid making it one. When I started to do experimental research in 2003, it was quite common that you differed between men and women. But that also created more levels, right? And it complicates your design and complicates your analysis of data. So if you don't think it's reasonable, avoid it. Experts and novices, it might be the case that you need to differ between that. In some studies, it doesn't really matter. So you need to take this into consideration. And this is examples from, let's say, quantitative research, but the same thing applies to other methods as well to some degree. So you need to consider it even if you're going to do an interview study, for example. And these are things to consider. Of course, the aim of the study, availability of participants and the potential confounding factors again then. But my advice is less is better. And of course, total participation time, it has to do with fatigue. I can give an example from, we have colleagues that work with haptics, you know. They did experiments, it's years back, but then they used a psychometric method, and to explain that in a simple way, the experiment doesn't end until you have reached a certain threshold in your responses. And if you get tired, if you can find it difficult, it will take time. And also, if it doesn't stop and you are tired, you would just randomly click, right? And then it will never stop. So we actually had a colleague that got a really, she got problems with her arm after this. She sat there for, I think, an hour and a half or 2, just clicking or doing stuff with these things. So yeah, really, really important to consider. But we learn as we go, right?
It's hard. I know it's hard to give a number, but when you mention about a long study or how viable you think, like how long should we go, 1 hour, or 1 hour is too much, 30 minutes?
I would say I wouldn't go for more than an hour, but it depends on what they're actually doing, and also if they need to focus all the time or if there are breaks between the activities that they do. They might switch between visualizations. They might have to read stuff or answer some questionnaire in between. But I would say that an hour, everyone can cope an hour, right? But if it's longer, I guess you need to prepare them. And it also depends, of course, on compensation if you have the availability of that. But that's a really good question. And then you also need to think about the assignment of order over different conditions, and that means then any level of the independent variable. That can be 2D versus 3D. Intergroups over tasks, etc. And you balance to avoid what we call order effects. So I mean, if everyone starts with the first condition followed by the second and followed by the third, what can happen here? Sorry?
They might just select the last one.
Yeah, But what I meant is if you spend 20 minutes doing this,
Mhm.
and then you spend 20 minutes here and 20 minutes there, then we can talk about perhaps people are tired there,
Yeah.
or perhaps they have learned between
Yeah.
this. So that is why we try to vary the order. And there are different procedures. You can use total randomization, for example, and then the belief is that things evens out. Or you can use procedures like Latin square, etc. So to handle this. And one thing that is very important to talk about also is that I said that you should less is better. Sometimes we tend to aim doing a really big study at the beginning, right? We want to test many things at many levels, perhaps divide people into different groups, etc. But that creates a really complex design, and the recommendation there is a low number for precision and clarity. And I just have some images here to illustrate. Let's say that you have different fonts. You can look into different sizes to see whether that has an effect. What is the readability between size 1, 2, and 3, for example? You can work with perhaps different contrasts and different colors, and you can only imagine how many conditions this actually creates, right? There might be interactions here, and the statistical analysis will be really, really complicated. So that is one advice. Try to make it as simple as possible, but still, of course, valid and scientifically sort of important for you. And then just a few things about tasks. They also have to be representative and appropriate for the visualization and the setting and the goals, the context that you are actually investigating. Also to have as high validity as possible. Here I can recommend to do pilot tests. What does that mean? Do you know? To make a pilot test?
I think, I'm not sure.
Yeah, but please.
Just to practice the interview questionnaire or the structure of the evaluation before the actual one.
Yeah, really good. It's actually test the test, as we used to say. So if you don't do pilot tests, you will not have the ability to actually realize until it's too late whether there is something wrong, if I can use that word. And as I said before, you can use pilot tests to establish thresholds and goals to measure towards, right? And this is also really important. You need to report and motivate on your tasks. Don't just describe in your paper that we had the participants perform 3 types of tasks and then simple names. You need to be a bit more elaborate than that, so the reader really understands what did they do. And that also goes with data. The recommendation is to use real data if you can. And why should we do that? Again, because we need good validity, right? But sometimes it isn't possible. If we want to measure, for example, visual perception, we might have to control the data so we know what is an accurate response and what is not. I did that also back in the days. I had a colleague, he's not here at the division, but he was before. He spent, I think, 6 or 7 months developing a synthetic data set that we could use for a number of different studies. And in every paper that we published, 1 or more reviewers commented on this. Why didn't you use real data? But when you do use real data, they might instead comment on, how can you be sure? You don't have all the insight into the data, right? And again, report thoroughly about the data that you have used and motivate why you have done it. And then it happens that you get a reviewer that doesn't buy it anyway, and you can't really control that. But there's decisions to be made here, and you also need to be aware of the implications of it, right? Let's see what time it is. 42. Yeah. Do you have any questions so far? I'm sorry that I'm a bit unfocused, but I don't have the presenter view here, so I don't see what slide is coming after either. So I have that is my excuse for that, and I don't have the notes either. Yeah. I will say a few things about conducting a user study, and some of you had done that, right? What are your sort of experience there when you're actually doing it?
To create everything, and there are always issues that you don't think could happen. And it's really hard to get a diverse set of people.
Mm.
So just from students is not enough, so we use Reddit to get more people to participate. That's worked out well.
Yeah.
But,
Thanks for sharing. I have a few notes here. Collect relevant information about the participants. What do I mean by that, do you think? When you have recruited your participants, have you sent out an email or gone perhaps into class if you're at campus and asked whether people would like to participate or not? Or have you recruited them in some different way?
both. We gave it to students, of course, we sent it to colleagues, mailing lists, and then we advertised it publicly on this sample size subreddit where people from everywhere can participate.
Mm.
And then, of course, we asked them what's their background, gender, rough age, but yeah.
But do you ask them that beforehand and perhaps decline, or do you?
The user study, they have to fill out first.
Yeah.
What's your background? How much do you know about graphs and everything? So we could have some estimate. Maybe it's only good for people that are already very familiar with the concept, and maybe it's not good for people who don't know anything about graph drawing. What's the idea?
Good. And that is how it usually works. You don't know them until they come to the test setting, right? So that is why it's so important to collect this information, because you can immediately realize that this person perhaps isn't correct, but of course you will let him or her do it anyway. But when you analyze the data, you can go back and see this is why these three people are outliers, because they didn't know enough. This person might be older or whatever it can be. So it's really, really important. And then you need to make a decision beforehand, what kind of information might be necessary. If gender isn't necessary, don't ask about it. If age isn't necessary, you don't really need to ask about that either. So you need to make informed decisions about this. But don't forget to collect as much relevant data as possible. You will regret it afterwards when you sit there with your data and you don't really make sense of all the results.
That we can, but maybe later we can discard them. For example,
Yes.
It's not important for us at the first age, but we collect it, and then when we collect, we consider that, for example, our app is more popular between age 18 and 26, and can bring us a new point of view.
Yeah, definitely. Why I say that is that if you want to ask a lot of things, it will take time for them to fill all these things. So you can make a trade-off there. But of course, the more information, the better. Yeah, and that is a really good point in your case there. And then I have written here, written, consistent material and scripts. When you welcomed your participants to the setting, did you inform them verbally, or did you hand out the written instructions?
It was completely online.
Oh, it was online.
We showed what they're supposed to do, gave an example where they could try it out, and then they got some data set of 10 or 15 where they had to do it themselves.
Okay. I usually say that have information and scripts in writing, and with scripts I mean what you as the moderator or evaluator are supposed to say and do. So all the participants get the same information. And I personally also, when I am part of a study and also when I have conducted them, I think it's nice to actually be able to sit and read by myself. And then I can ask questions if something isn't clear. And also I can go back to this during the study. It depends, of course, on the nature of the study, how extensive it is. But also having written scripts for you ensures reliability in the sense that you know that all of you will say the same things to the participants if you are more than one. And also you will not forget. I mean, how many have you tested in total in a row?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. But let's say that you do experiments for 3 days in a row. When you are on participant 27, you are a bit tired of the entire procedure, right? So you can forget things. So that's why I have that as a point there. Instructions, interview guides, presentation of individual tasks and other activities that actually take part. What about getting to know the visualization that you are supposed to test as a participant? This is also an important factor, right? Sometimes we don't want them to know anything about it before, and then you need to tell them that in the instruction. But sometimes it's also important that they either familiarize themselves to get an overall sense of what it's about, and sometimes they really need to do some practice trials to get really familiar with it, right? But that is just you who knows. It depends on the aim with the study and also what their previous knowledge, their knowledge level. But it needs to be considered. And also this is super important. Are you supposed to answer any questions during the evaluation or not? This very much depends on the nature of the study. But let's say that you answer questions for some people and not for others. You affect the results, right? This is also a confounding factor that you need to take into consideration. In some pure qualitative studies, it really doesn't matter. In a quantitative study, it can ruin everything, right? Oi, what happened? And again, perform at least one pilot study here. This is just a brief overview of important things to consider. And then when it comes to analyze the result, you approach this differently, whether you have qualitative data or quantitative. And this is an image I have borrowed from Niklas. This is an example of free text answers in a questionnaire. We will look into how that works after the break. But you can understand it's just free text comments to statements or questions in a questionnaire. Then you need to make sense of that, right? And you don't really need to look what this actually says, but it shows here that you have categories of questions and you group the respondents. They are here illustrated in figures. This is everyone that sort of said something like that, etc. So you try to make sense and then you need to work from there, of course. Often we have some sort of coding scheme. If you work with specific goals or requirements, you can group your results, qualitative results, under these headings, so to speak. You can also use the questions from the questionnaire as they are, or make your own sort of categorization. But you need to plan before you start your study, how are we going to sort of both collect the data, but especially how are we going to sort of handle them and analyze them when it's time to do that. And then quantitative data. I've already said that you need to choose an appropriate test, and a test that is appropriate to the nature of the data. And we talk about parametric versus non-parametric tests. These are some references. The old one, I mean, I'm sure there's newer books, but I haven't looked into them, so I recommend these ones. I think it's this one is actually called Discovering Statistics and Rock and Roll something. I don't want to say the word. It's a cool dude. But they are very pedagogic, explaining how to actually approach statistical testing, what a test to use, and described in a fairly easy and straightforward approach. Yeah, common sense and formal procedures. And what do we mean by common sense? Yeah, how do we deal with outliers? Sometimes it's okay to include them, sometimes it's not. And then there are described in literature formal procedures on how to handle these things, right? And then I love this image, and I was actually supposed to take a picture of the entire image, but some PhD student borrowed this book long ago, and it wasn't in my office. That's when I realized the person never returned it. It's a really, really old book. I had this when I studied cognitive science, my master's, so that's ages ago. Back in the days, we actually had to calculate all these statistical tests by hand, and we had exams on it. Now we just use digital software to do it, right? But when I say that the test that you are supposed to use comes from the design and the nature of data. And with this sort of flow charts, you can see, do I have one variable or two or more? If I have two or more, then how many experimental conditions per variable? Three or more, the same participants or not? Is data parametric or not? So this is a really, really good aid to learn how to use the correct test. Because I mentioned problems with if you violate statistical validity, right? And that you do if you choose the wrong test. But I'm not going into details about that, but it's really, really good to know how to approach it. How many of you have done or aim to do quantitative studies, doing statistical analysis? Yeah. Are you an expert in the field? Yeah.
I have one question for you. So it's quite common, even reviews mention, right? When we do the user study, they say like, but you did not have enough participants to do a statistical study. What is your thought, like? How many participants then should we have? Because I know that if you have too few, the statistical results are not that good.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that is the issues with the too low number of n. And to be honest, I don't have the exact number, but you can do the calculations there. If you can calculate effect sizes and statistical power, and that then indicates how many participants you need to reach this. But when I haven't done quantitative studies myself in my research for quite some time, but I think that at most we had 30 participants, and we had, I think, as low as 20, and that was accepted. But also, of course, you need to, I have seen studies where you have a statistically significant results, a p-value below 0.05, and you make a lot of claims about your data. That is perhaps not really acceptable, right? So you also need to discuss, what does this mean? But still, if you have got these results, it's valid, but there might be a lot of things around that actually factors how sort of reliable and valid it is. But I don't have as I said, is there a golden number of n? No, it's not a simple question to answer.
Because I wrote one paper about network validation. So I think we had 17 participants or something like that. We wrote the paper, we wrote the statistical analysis, we did everything correctly, supposedly. But the reviews say like, yeah, this is statistical, it's not valid. So discard this whole section.
Yeah, but did they say why? Did they give you any useful feedback? No.
They didn't say exactly why, but they say discard.
Yeah, I know.
That's good.
But that is a problem that we all have to live with, right? Our papers get rejected, but perhaps we don't get the constructive feedback to realize why. And let's say that's a side note, we should take a break, but I have reviewed many papers that have done evaluation studies, and I look into specific things that might lead me to give a low score, whereas another reviewer doesn't really know. So, I mean, if you are doing an evaluation study, you might get reviewers that are knowledgeable. They will also accept minor flaws if you discuss them. Whereas other have heard sometimes that no, 20 participants isn't enough, so this study isn't good enough. But they don't really have the knowledge behind them, so to speak, to do these claims. But it happens. Yeah. Okay, I think we should take a break. Do you agree? I think you are back now, right? Yeah. I have asked a lot of questions, and I'm so happy that you interact with me, but that also means that I am a bit short of time now. I will go through some slides a bit quick, but there's also no point in me reading everything that is there. And if you want, I can upload the slides on my Google Drive, so you can have a look at them later on. And I should do that so you get all the references as well. But we will have a look at these methods here, because the aim is that you will use one or more during the exercise. We have talked a lot about measurements, but often we measure task performance in some way, right? And we collect quantitative data. And we have talked about that we need to have a high degree of control to be able to trust the results. And there are things to consider as number of participants, conditions, tasks, etc. And then we have talked about observation. What can be interesting if you do observation during an evaluation study, it can be interesting to look into facial and bodily expressions. What does that say about their attitudes and performance? So this can complement other type of data. I wouldn't recommend it to use that alone. Very, very early in the development process, sure, just to gather as much information as possible. And then we have interviews where we ask a person questions. As it say, gain specific knowledge, you have specific aims. You can also have them talk more freely. Then you will get to know things that you didn't thought of asking yourself. They can also be used to ask follow-up questions to a questionnaire. This is one of my main advice to my students. If you administer a questionnaire and you get a numerical rating for a lot of items, but if they reply 2, 2, 2, which is negative, you would like to know why, right? You don't want the statistics. You want to know the reason to the statistics, right? An interview can have different structure. A totally structured interview is a set of perhaps 10, 15 predefined questions. You ask each question to each participant in the same order. And why do we do this? To ensure reliability, right? It can also be totally unstructured. You basically have a conversation. Really interesting, but in the end, you can end up with a huge collection of data, and you need to make some sense out of it, right? This is the best approach, I would say. You use both of them. A structured interview guide, and then you make room for some free discussion as well. And then we have think aloud, another method that I really, really like. It means that you have your users, your participants perform a number of tasks or activities, and you encourage them to speak while they are doing it, to verbalize their thoughts, their behaviors, their attitudes, what they would like to do, what they think would happen next, etc. You will get to know their mental models, what's going on in here, which is impossible to know in any other way, basically. There are, of course, some things to consider. It can interfere with their actual performance when they are doing tasks, so you need to take that into consideration. They might feel interrupted and forget where they were if they start to talk a lot. Some people think that it's demanding mentally. They can get tired. And also, this is very important to realize, there's a variation in how verbal we actually are. So if you feel that some person doesn't really speak, try to encourage them as much as possible. But if it feels uncomfortable, just let them be, and then perhaps you discard that data. There's alternative to overcome some of these issues. You can have two participants working together to be sort of co-constructive. I myself think that it's at most times valuable to work with someone else. You get each other going, you give each other associations that you perhaps wouldn't come up with. And sometimes one person speaks more than the other. You can also make teams with one expert and one novice, for example. Something is natural and obvious for the expert, but the novice might struggle with something, and then they will discover that together and will give you a more rich view of the session than if you had tested them separately. What is important, and something that my students tend to forget, even that when I point it out, is that if you have participants talk aloud, you cannot take any quantitative measurements during that time, right? If you want to investigate task performance and measure response time, if some persons speak a lot and some a little, I mean, the results are flawed, right? But there are ways to overcome this. You can have them do the measurement first and then go back in some way, either go back themselves or show them a recording or so. And then they will have to memorize what they did. But this is also something to consider then. But this is, I think, a very, very good method. It depends on the aim with the study, of course. And then we have questionnaires. You all know what a questionnaire is, right? You have to respond in some way to written statements or questions. And these can be used to collect information before the study. We have talked about that already. And also we use them after a study to collect the subjective dimension of our data, right? And here we have two types of statements or questions. Closed-ended, where you have to choose from sort of predefined statements or questions. We often rate them on a scale. The responses are numerical values. Or they can answer freely. This is when we end up with a lot of free text data, right? That we need to handle in some way. Examples of Likert scales. A question of statement, and then you have to rate to what extent you agree or not. Here you have 5 alternatives, and here you have 7. There's a difference here, right? The aim with 7 or 9, which we also see sometimes, it's to get a more nuanced answer. But to be honest, what is the difference between 5 and 6? Is that clear to you? I find that a bit difficult myself, but that's also when you analyze the results, you have to take that into consideration. You can also force the respondents to make a decision. Either they are positive or negative, and they can be that to a greater extent as well, right? In this case, this is called a 4 alternative forced choice scale. Again, it depends on your aim with the study. But it's not fun to end up with just a 3, which is sort of undecided, or yeah, it works. You don't want an average score of 3 on everything, right? Also, when you design, you need to be cautious on how you sort of formulate your questions or statements. You can have a positive wording, or you can have a negative wording here. But in each case, 5 is strongly agree, but that is a positive response and that is a negative response, right? There's many advice around this, but one is be consistent. It will be easier for the respondent and it will be easier for you to analyze the data afterwards. But there's of course a trade-off here. There's no sort of clear answer that this is right and this is wrong, but it's something that is definitely important to consider when you design your own questionnaires. Yeah, and before I get to the next slide, it is common that we design our own questionnaires, and sometimes we feel that it's necessary because we have specific questions tailored to our study that we really need to have answered. But that means that you have to do the design yourself, and you don't really know if these are reliable and valid measures, right? So there is work on doing standardized questionnaires where one have done extensive work in designing each item and looked into the rating scales, etc. And there's a few out there. And I was inspired. We have Petra Isenberg, one of the authors here, visiting a couple of weeks ago. And she talked about two of their scales. One is called Previs. It's a rating scale that we can use to assess perceived readability. In the paper, they discuss and define the concept. What do we mean by perceived readability? So I really encourage you to read that if you are interested. But there's 4 individual scales that deals with understanding the layout, the data read, and the data features, which means patterns such as relationships, etc. 11 questions in total. This is what it looks like on one of their websites. And this is the actual sheet that you can use. You can design your own, or you can download it from there. I have printed out versions as well. It's a there's 7 scale steps, and there's also a, I don't know, not applicable option. And then they say that if people choose that option, they should be encouraged to describe why. My advice would be always ask them to describe, motivate their responses if you have the time for it. Because as I said, it can be used to give you more information than just a 3 or 4 or 5, etc. Most of the authors that have designed a new method say that they're not meant to replace other methods. They should be used as complements. But sometimes perhaps you just want to make a study investigating this. So feel free to use it then. Here they say that you can use all of the scales to get a holistic view of your visualization, but you can also choose to just use 1 or 2 of the subscales as well. You will calculate a single score by average in individual items ratings, yeah? And you should use this score to sort of compare between visualizations. It's not an absolute measure. You can't say that if I get an average score of 4, that is super good, right? You should always use it in comparison with something, or make an informed decision based on theory, previous work before. But we have talked about that you need to create something to compare with, right? This is another one, a really simple one. It only consists of 5 items there. And the aim here is to assess what is called aesthetic pleasure. I read that there are sort of established criteria for aesthetics in graph drawing, right? But they define also the concept. They say it's not really possible to measure aesthetic pleasure, but they talk about pleasure and beauty. And this is the rating scale that they have designed. Again, read the paper for their sort of theory and motivations and their extensive work on making sure that this is both reliable and valid when it comes to measuring aesthetic pleasure. Here, on the other hand, you can actually calculate a mean and obtain 1 single value. So you can compare perhaps 5 visualizations and you get a single value for each, which you can use. And again, of course, used together with other types of methods. And they recommend that you use this scale before the user have actually used and get familiarized with the visualization as a measure of a first impression, because that impression can be affected if it's super difficult. You might not think that it's very aesthetically pleasing, right? There's not, as I said, always a correlation between this. But you can, of course, use it afterwards as well, but take these things into consideration. This is just an example of how you can actually combine different methods, because that is a point. They emphasize that in their publications, and I do that as well. I will not go into details, but this was a study we did 2011. It's a medical visualization table, and they wanted to investigate how that was going to be implemented and accepted in a clinical environment. So we tested orthopedic surgeons, and the objective was to investigate a number of design goals and requirements. They should experience similarity with the real world. It should be responsive and robust. No learning threshold for basic interaction, etc. 5 participants, and this paper has been mentioned in one of the survey papers I showed before as an example study where 5 participants is enough, which was very nice for us to read, of course. And here I have highlighted things that sort of relate to what we have talked about before. Written instructions and training. They did tasks, they should talk aloud, think aloud. We had the prepared interview guide. We made sure that everyone answered all of the questions either during using the interface or afterwards in an interview. And then they also answered a questionnaire. So 4 methods to collect as much data as possible. And then finally, we have inspection methods, which is called heuristic evaluation. Have you heard about that before? In its original form, it was usability experts that looked into a system, and based on their knowledge and expertise, they judged how well that system complied to a set of specific design guidelines. It didn't involve users, no specific tasks, you just did some sort of free exploration. These have been very advantageous. It's cost effective, it's quick, it's easy to learn, etc. But there are also disadvantages. Expertise can vary. It can be difficult to interpret the guidelines correctly, etc., etc. It has also been updated during the years. Now we can include users or double experts, specific tasks, so we make sure that the ones doing the inspection actually examines what we need answers to, right? Otherwise they might miss it. And this very important new heuristics. The original ones talked about visibility of system status. Was it aesthetically pleasing? Did I get feedback? Nothing about interaction, complexity of data, etc., etc. So there are a number of proposed heuristics that has worked with this. Uncertainty visualization, you know Schneiderman's task by data type taxonomy, I guess. Overview, filter, zoom, etc. Many information visualization people familiar with that. Interaction and visual complexity, etc. So you can have a look if you are interested in this. But what is important for us is recent publications here. The aim here is to do heuristic evaluation, but sort of focus on the value of visualization. And what is value of visualization? They define that. Again, they don't want to replace traditional evaluations, but they feel that we need to know more than how fast can we solve a specific task. What does that task actually give us? What is the value here? There's an anagram ICE-T. There's a website there, but I have other sources which I think is better. There's an equation there that consists of 4 concepts: time, insight, essence, and confidence. These are the 4 things that we can use to measure if a visualization is valuable or not. There are 3 hierarchical levels. The top level components there, which I showed you the names. Then there's a set of mid-level guidelines that elaborate on the concepts. And then third, there are heuristics that are actionable and rateable, which means that they are supposed to be easy to understand and relate to you in a way that you can with confidence rate to the extent that you feel that these visualizations follow this guideline. This is how that sheet looked like. So you see here, the first level in the hierarchy, the mid-level, and these are the actual heuristics, the guidelines that you are supposed to read. And then you judge whether the visualization complies to these ones or not. And then you rate it on this scale. And here are some recommendations for apply it. It's best to engage people with experience and knowledge about visualization, but they also say that students might be possible. It depends on the aim of the study and their knowledge and what you sort of actually do during the study. You can also have some sort of training sessions, etc. Some sort of complexity and interactivity, not just static images. And you should get the participants familiar with it and also provide some extra information about who's the intended user, where it's supposed to be used, etc. And finally, you can calculate a score for each of them. And here they actually provide something to measure against. 5 or higher is good, 4 or less means that you need to make some considerations and read the signs, right? Okay, we finished there. I'm sorry. You are supposed to have coffee now. I talked more than I expected, and again, you also talked with me more than I expected, so I'm very grateful for that. But now go for coffee and see you again at 5, right?
4.
4, yeah.
Yeah. 3.
Thank you.